quickly end up being lost if we don't have truth in our midst. We just realized that, and because of our cat here, we just realized that you weren't able to hear us all this time.
So here we are talking about truth, and we're talking about history, and we're talking about the human spirit needing to be free. So, and anyway, hopefully you could read lips for the first.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start again with Darryl Milena Weinberg. And well, we welcome you here to the Smarten App Show on Messianic Lamb Network.tv. And we also just wanted to share with you topics that have to do with education, raising family, and so forth. And just to recap what we were chatting about is that we in past shows we've talked about the importance of teaching history in homeschool.
Yeah.
And for this week, and it was inspired by us attending a conference where this lady that we really respect made a presentation about just kind of our society and the thoughts and what we were how we were trained to think and so forth. Like, really interesting presentation. But she was describing something about the liberal arts that are being offered in our public realm as an education. And my big surprise that liberal arts, the whole free arts, had nothing to do with the freedom to choose what to learn, but had to do that they were financially free, available to the public masses.
Yeah.
To the poor people. But that education that was liberally given freely to the masses was really intended to keep slaves of slaves. So not a very good quality or full education was given, just the minimum so that they could be literate enough to function, but not to become leaders and freedom thinkers of their time. So because nobody wants their slave to no longer decide not to be a slave because they realize they have rights not to be a slave. And so if you're going to teach them anything, it's going to be just enough to give them some ideas, but not enough to overturn the ruling class.
Well, and again, we talked about Frederick Douglass and how he was a slave back in the early 1800s, and his master's wife was a Christian. She taught him to read so that he could read his Bible. I mean, she had pure intentions, and her husband really got after her and said, you can't teach them how to read because they will forever be unfit to be a slave after that. Because once a man knows that he is in bondage, he's going to do everything that he can in order to free himself. And the most important thing about education is to give people the understanding of the pursuit of ideas. Right. And ideas, in truth, will always lead us toward freedom. And so what tyrants want to do, if you look at, what is the main focus, certainly within the internet, the media. I mean, we've got a bill before Parliament right now. It's called the Online Harms Bill. And essentially what it is online censorship. Because the last thing a tyrannical government wants is the free flowing of ideas. Because when you have the exchange of ideas, and I talked about how university means unidiversity, means plurality of one. Ideas. Yeah. So you have the unity, but there's a plurality at the same time. So which means that we can exchange ideas and even differ on things, but still have a common cause and purpose. Great example is, and I was talking with a friend of mine earlier about this today, the timing of the rapture. We were just at a conference where you had different speakers who had different views of the timing of the rapture. And you know what? And that's fine. Everybody can have their own opinion. That shouldn't be a point of division for us.
What your main belief is should still not be affected by your difference in what you believe in, kind of things that are not affecting your present right now.
Yeah, and I think it was Martin Luther. Well, it wasn't Martin Luther, but it was someone back in the Reformation period who said, in essentials unity, in non-essentials diversity, but in all things charity. so that we can agree to disagree on certain things as long as the fundamental beliefs are in line with each other. And, we can walk away and say, well, you know what? I have a different opinion.
Or just learning to coexist. And so as I'm a like as a I was just earlier saying that as a homeschool mom, I've realized that history is important because my brain works more of the math and sciences kind of mode quite often. And it wasn't until I started homeschooling that I realized that teaching history, and so having to learn history in order to be able to teach it, gives us a lot of lessons to make good decisions now for our future, for
Yeah.
our current and future generations. And so after we have spent a show speaking about the importance of teaching history, I just realized, and this conference that we attended, I just realized I need to look into the history of education in Canada, North America in general, because the American Canadian history are quite intertwined
Mhm.
because of the influences of France and England and all the European countries that have come to explore and claim land here in North America for themselves. And of course, just like you said, you know, uh, education's being offered, but usually um, anywhere throughout history. And as I'm going to do some reading in a moment about what I found out about the history of education here in Canada. But all of the structuring and the motivation to provide education for the masses has always been to assimilate the masses into a culture that is going to be controlled by the elite, by the ruling class, by those, and so as I went to it is the Open Library, um, and I found an article, Sociology of Education in Canada, and as I was reading that, I thought, you know what, this was one of the few neutral things I'm reading nowadays about the history of education in Canada and how it started, and of course the history of education of Canada is pretty much like the history of Canada, which is the tension between the French and the British that has first had the aspiration to colonize the land here and to claim it for themselves. Of course, we know because the indigenous people were here before, and then the Vikings made it at some point. But really, it was the battles between France and England that really established how are we going to be ruled and regulated here in North America. So I guess after the American Revolution, and you see, the establishment of the United States really kind of pushed the establishment of Canada. They kind of initiated the process.
Well, sure.
Because what happened, we had the first 13 colonies that fought and were able to win independence for themselves, free from the rule of England.
Mhm.
So all those who were still loyal to England came up north here in North America, in Canada, so they were called the Loyalists, right? And a lot of them were of English descent, while most of the population here in Canada was of French descent. Because what happened is, as the French and the English came in, the British were really more interested in harvesting the resources of the land. It was the French that were really interested in coming and settling here.
Yeah.
And it was because of different political and socioeconomic things that were happening back home in France.
Mhm.
So really the first settlements were French here in Canada.
Mhm.
But as the British were trying to kind of get, to colonize the land and to get the resources, they realized they need to be claiming the land. So there was a whole fight. And anyway, so what happens though is a lot of those British descent people came into Canada, and now we had the French culture and the British culture. And even though the British had most of the land, they had given the rights to the French to keep their language, culture, customs,
At
religion.
least over in Europe, they had the English Channel to separate them. Here we had no separation whatsoever, so
Well,
they
but
were
see,
going back and
so
forth
what
with each other.
happened is so the British government said, "What we're gonna do now? We have all these English and French people, and they're not mixing very well."
Yeah.
So that's kind of led to the development of Upper and Lower Canada.
Right.
So Lower Canada was the French,
Mhm.
and it's interesting when you look at the map. Really, Upper Canada is further north. Lower Canada is further north, Upper Canada is lower, but that's because they used the St. Lawrence River, which was the main route. And so it was like the lower parts of the river was Lower Canada. And as you
Even
go,
though it goes
well,
up.
it goes, well, yeah. So what happens is the St. Lawrence River actually goes from north to south. That's kind of how it flows. So,
No, it goes south to north.
so no, Lower Canada is, oh, right, how it flows. But what they said is lower
Lower down the river.
lower down the river is Lower Canada, which is really further north because it goes north, and then Upper Canada is up the river of St. Lawrence River. So our geography really played a role. But anyway, just to explain the difference between Upper and Lower Canada, but Upper is British, Lower is French. That's what we need to know.
And that's essentially where we got Ontario and Quebec from.
And you see, the provinces of Ontario and Quebec were really the main, like the ones that started Canada altogether. Like that's where our main population. And so a lot of the history of education in Canada is from the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, because that's where the struggle for dominance really was. And so once the French-speaking people were under British governance, even though they were given some freedom, there had to be, they still had to be subject to the King of England. And so there comes the rise of education in Canada. So Lower Canada, what happened? So with over 400 years of history summarizing the development of education in French Canada, and we are going to, so what this article says, we're only partially covering the events that led to the education system, what we know now as Quebec. So everything was driven by the difference between French and English Canada, meant the education developed rather differently in Quebec compared to the rest of the country. So settling Canada by the 1600s, a system of petit école, which is small schools, had been established by the French regime early in the century. So at the beginning, it was all French rule here.
Yeah.
And so because their motivation was to settle, they are the first ones that started schools here in the Canadian territory. So what it offered is basic education, mainly to boys within the strict Catholic framework. You know, a lot of people from France came here because of their religious freedom. They wanted to have religious freedom. And because the families, the girls were pretty much helping with the household, the boys were the ones who received education. The girls were either educated at home or not at all. You know, that's what so those little schools were first developed for boys. And they were under the Catholic Church's jurisdiction. And so later on in the 1639, then nuns, the first Catholic nuns to arrive to the New World, established schools for girls. Okay, and they stressed the domestic skills and like needlework as well as religious studies. So in the towns of New France, religious orders provided education instruction, covering the 3 R's. We still call it the reading, writing, and arithmetic. You know, I still laugh about the fact that the third one is not really an R, but anyway.
Alliteration makes it much easier to remember.
It's the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. So that's what they focused on: religious studies, while more advanced education pursuits were available for males who wanted to enter the clergy or train in a profession. And then we have the colleges of the Jesuits that were established in 1635, which offered classical education and theological training to males. And in the 1660s, there were seminaries founded by the Bishop Laval, which is known as the University of Laval. So at the beginning in New France, the education was really a religious education and was really headed by the religious institutions. Catholic missionaries also played a large role in the education of colonists in New France, and many of their ambitions were oriented towards assimilating the Aboriginal people to the ways of the French. And it is funny, I will finish this sentence, but it is funny because the original intent was that the native people will be brought into the Catholic religion and to be assimilated to French culture. And not long after that, when the British took over the land, that's what they wanted to do to the French after. So call it karma or call it like reaping what you sow. But funny enough, though, that education throughout history here in North America or anywhere around the world was used to assimilate people and change the ways of other people that were, the minority or the weaker people within society.
Well, obviously every religion wants to promote itself as being true. Now, if you've been tuning into my messages over the past few weeks, on Saturdays on the Ruach Hamed broadcast, I talk about the history of the Jesuits and where they came from. And these were not very nice people. And their primary objective was to promote the Catholic Church and the Catholic religion. And they would use any means necessary. So they're experts at infiltration. There's a lot of major corporations that have had Jesuit training, like for instance, Rupert Murdoch, who is the owner of Fox News and News Corporation. He has Jesuit training. And so there are a lot of techniques that are used by the Jesuits that are not to the benefit of the people being taught. Let's just put it that way. They have been involved in some very, very dastardly things over the centuries. And so that being the primary push, you're going to get indoctrination into things. And so the fact that, but uh, all that to be said is that the purpose in settling new lands is to um, what you would call Hellenization. I mean, the Greeks were the original ones that they would promote their culture. Before that, whether it be the Babylonians or the Medo-Persians, who were the first world empires, they weren't so concerned about pushing their religion or their culture on conquered lands. They just wanted the resources and they wanted the taxation. Bend the knee to the king, and you can worship whatever god you
Well,
want.
at first it was power by force, but then they realized if they use the education and the way they change the people's thinking is a more powerful way.
Well, but Alexander the Great was really the first one to promote this idea, and that he thought that the Hellenic culture, the Greek culture, was superior, and that it would be to the benefit of all these other cultures to push these ideas. And so Hellenization, coming from Helena, one of the goddesses, et cetera. Interesting enough, Constantine's mother is also, her name was Helena.
It was a popular name.
Yeah, well, yeah. But so you have the proselytization of imposing your culture either by education or by force,
but
whichever.
it does come from ego, though. It comes from pride, because thinking that you are superior than the people you're trying to, you think you're doing them a favor because look, I'm so good. You should be more like, my community.
Now, you do have, out of Greek philosophy and everything else, the beginnings of democracy. So there was some credence to the fact that Greek culture was superior to the others, even though it was highly pagan. But even when it comes to the Bible, for instance, when the Jewish people came under Greek dominance, the philosophical ideas forced the Jewish people to kind of relook at their scriptures differently, and out of that you get the Septuagint, and out of that you get an advancement of the ideas of Jewish culture, which ended up leading to the writings of the New Covenant.
Right. As long as, we often speak about advancement, as long as it's not, and again, we talked about that God's ways are eternal. And so not all advancement is good. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it is not. So going back to Canada and on what happens here in Canada. So we were talking about Lower Canada, which is the French part of Canada, which is nowadays Quebec. And so the first schools that were established were oriented towards assimilating the Aboriginal people to the ways of the French, but with little success. Obviously, the native people resisted, um, like anybody else would, of course, is because they were also not treated well, like you said. And this is one thing, just recently has become a big thing in Canada. We've recognized that we have not treated our Aboriginal people well.
Well, we've
And,
known that for a long time. It's
but it
just
was
that there was no will to do anything about it.
yes, exactly. And so what happened is then in up lower Canada, a series of wars between the French and the British led to the conquering of the New France in 1763. So, like I said, the French were trying to overtake the Aboriginals, but then not long after, the British took over the land. And so the increase of settlers in the British Empire resulted in the Constitutional Act of 1791, which created the Upper and Lower Canada. So we were um, still trying to have people of two different cultures in one place, and they were just given their own territory, even almost like their own governing system, as long as they kind of were answering to the King of England ultimately. And so nothing happened without the overseeing, and this is why we have the representatives of the king or the queen in Canada still, to just kind of overlook the political scene, even though we have freedom nowadays. So anyway, so this is what happened. So political concerns in Quebec were distinct from those in the rest of Canada due to major cultural, linguistic, and religious differences. Rebellions occurred within the 1830s by patriots who attempted to invade Upper Canada and Lower Canada. So those were the Americans, the patriots, who thought, you know what, look at how the king is really having really heavy rule on these people of Canada. Let's go liberate them.
Yeah.
But the Canadians never wanted to be liberated. But that's a different topic and different story.
Manifest destiny, even back then.
Yeah. So that was New France, which soon the land of New France became Lower Canada. Let's talk a little bit about Upper Canada, which is kind of the more British settlement here. So the first government efforts toward publicly funded schools dates in the late 1790s, when Legislative Council and House of the Assembly of Upper Canada requested from the King of England that land and funds be given to establish schools and a university, a request that was honored. And so in 1799, acts were passed that guaranteed technical education for orphan children and required that teachers be certified. It should be noted that Lower Canada was now part of the British colony, which is now the French were part of that too. So having ceded defeat to the British, so thus the legislation passed in Upper Canada was applicable to Lower Canada as well. But as discussed, the acceptance of these imposed education laws was met by resistance in Lower Canada. So the French were told, whatever we decide here in the French part, in the English part, you're going to do in the French part. But there was a lot of back and forth on that. So that's our history. In 1807, a district school act signaled the first official action in government-aided schooling. The act allocated one school to each district. However, it also required the payment of tuition. So before there was taxation, even though the government, provided funds for the building of schools, in order for the kids to participate in those schools, they had to be some tuition. Okay, what happens? So tuition meant that education would not be available to all children due to the lack of financial means, and critics argued that the arrangement was reserved for the rich, and the schools resembled the elite grammar schools that currently existed in England. And critics called for a true system of common schooling that would be available to all. So every time there's tuition, there is the concept only for the rich people. And yes, that is kind of the case. If you don't have the financial resources, you can't do that. But let's kind of read on into history. What happens when we offer that truly free education? While the district school did, in fact, serve the elite who would afford the tuition, there's evidence that the desire of common schooling accessible to all the being favored on more widespread basis. So the Kingston Gazette, a conservative newspaper at the time, also expressed such sentiment in 1810. And that was the quote that I really went, there's like the foundation of our education right there. Our population is composed of persons born in different states and nations under various governments and laws, speaking several languages. To assimilate them, or rather their descendants, into one congenial people by all uh, practicable means is an object of true policy, and the establishment of common schools is one of those means. So, again, what I'm seeing is yes, we'll give everybody education, but the purpose of that is to assimilate everybody because everybody has different languages, different cultures, different ideas, different family values. Let's get them all into one school and make them all the same. And they were talking not so much the people who came, but the next generations, target the next generation to be a one people. And of course, this is what I'm teaching our pod right now, the War of 1812. So that proposal that I just read was done in 1810, but the War of 1812 kind of put a little bit of a pause in all the education plans because it was quite a severe war. So after the war ended,
well, we live where the War of 1812 happened.
We live on the battlegrounds. Yes, there's a lot of forts around us, different protective forts.
We have Fort George that's up in Niagara Falls. Down in Fort Erie, we have that was a major battleground.
Anything along the lakes and the waterways that are connected, their forts and battles were taking place along that, and so. So that was a war between Canada and the United States, but really it was between the British government that ruled Canada. The Canadians, who kind of were separated themselves from England, did not want to be part of that war. But anyway, so what happened is, however, the Common School Act was passed in 1816. So I think the War of 1812 ended around 1814, a couple years later. And then by 1816, a Common School Act was passed, which was the first major step in providing mass schooling for the common people in Upper Canada. So I remember Upper Canada was the British part of Canada. This act provided a grant to each of the 10 districts and also created boards of education within each district, which were to be responsible for textbooks, courses, establishing school rules. As well, within the district, any community that had 20 or more students could establish school that would have 3 trustees who would be responsible for hiring and firing teachers. There was great uptake in requests for government-aided schools, so much so that the government requests outweighed the financial resources available from the government, resulting in a bill that was passed in order to slow the growth of these schools. So the government decided they're going to provide funds, but the request for education was so great that their funds weren't enough. What do you think would happen next? How do we provide the funds? How shall we do that? Taxes. All righty.
Because the government really only has one bullet in its gun.
Well, but where would the money come from if it doesn't come from the people, right?
And that's not necessarily to say it's a bad thing, because
it is not if the government serves the interests of the people.
Because if you look, let's just take, and now's not a good time to compare these things, but if you look back 20 to 30 years ago, the difference between the Canadian and the American medical system. The American medical system, although it has the most advanced medicine and medical techniques in the world, it is by far and away the worst run of all countries' medical. So
advancements in science and technology does not equal availability to the people.
Well, yes, and it's because of the corruption and the fact that you have the the pharma mafia and lobbyists for the pharmaceutical companies run the American government essentially. But in Canada, 20 to 30 years ago, you could get sick and you would be comfortable in the fact that you could get your need taken care of without getting bankrupted. In the United States, even though you might have access to, for certain people, superior medical treatment. Um, the
But may
fact that
I mention, in Canada, we're paying more taxes. That's why we have that education available to not education, but
yeah, well,
medical.
socialized medicine always does cost more. I get
Yeah,
that, but that's because of inefficiencies. To have a universal medical system is a great idea in theory. The problem becomes, like anything when it comes to a centrally planned system, is that it is rife for that. That's why communism, in theory, is a wonderful
all
idea,
animals are equal, but all of a sudden some become more equal than
but
others.
because of human nature and the fact that
Yeah,
we're always looking for, communism actually works in the kibbutz
small.
system
Yeah.
in Israel, because everybody is there for the same reason. It's for the common good. You cannot impose that upon an entire nation, and that's why, as a political system, it doesn't work. So it's the same thing, that in theory, socialized medicine is a great idea, because you want to give everybody access to equal medical treatment. You don't want some people to die on the operating table because they can't whip out the check. And it's the same thing with education.
Absolutely, and you know what? And this is why Upper and Lower Canada was created, so that the people who have similar ideas would govern themselves. But we are starting to see that how this dominance of the British is, they're starting to tell the French, well, you got whatever we decide, you got to do in your education system.
Right.
So in 1840, the two Canadians, Upper and Lower Canada, were combined into the United Province of Canada. So it no longer became efficient for them to have two separate kind of groups.
Right.
Ultimately, they combined them. And the School Act for the United Province of Canada in 1841 was passed shortly thereafter, which created non denominational public schools. Because obviously the French relied on the Catholic religion, the British had different ideas, right? So that gave the rise of non denominational public schools for Upper Canada that were not oriented toward any particular religion. Publicly funded Protestant and Catholic schools were created for residents of Lower Canada. So that's why we have now publicly funded Catholic and 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 we have like secular system as well.
Mhm.
That kind of came from that. Um, a compulsory taxation system was also introduced to levy the school taxes. So it's interesting how the need for education and to assimilate a community brought to a lot of political decisions, including taxation. Now, like I said, if the government serves the people, taxation is actually a fair thing. If you want the benefits of the government to give you land or whatever, it's good to pay into that. Okay.
There are certain things that it
Yeah.
is good to have the government take care of if it's done efficiently. But the problem is that you always have people who are drawn to government who have their own personal interest in mind, as opposed to public service.
Well, but and think about it though, if the whole idea of education is to bring people to make them more like us, then it's inherently that if something's going to go wrong. And so, in addition to the common schools, so that was the free public education system, there also existed voluntary schools, which were mostly located in large urban centers and financed by the private tuition fees. So now we have publicly funded system and private education system, which we still have here in Canada. So prior to 1840, these types of schools were varied in their offerings. Some were select academic schools serving the elite, while others were day schools offering education to anyone who would afford modest fees. So now they were trying to create the three tier, the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class. So, but think about it, the free education was offered to the lower class. If you wanted a little bit more, you paid a little fee. So that was the middle class. And if you could pay more and you get even better education. So, yes, that's been historic for Canada. Um, so these type of schools were varied in their offerings. And so I just read that. So 1840, however, after 1840, voluntary schools became almost exclusively associated with boarding schools attended exclusively by members of the upper social class, um, and while others went to common schools. Actually, the elimination of middle class started around that time.
Hmm.
the attempt to eliminate that, because you kind of said, well, why do we have a limited offering with a limited fees? Either go free or go like to the really elite education. So the difference between common schools and the voluntary school was also associated with the idea of respectability. Um, so many viewed education as the responsibility of the parents. So even though that system was created, the mind of the public was the parents should be teaching their children. And we're trying to now bring that idea back with School Pods Canada.
Right.
Although the grant added common schools were tainted with the stigma of being charity schools, suitable only for those students whose parents were not able to properly provide for their children. Mixing with such children also carried the reputation of being inherently risky, as common schools were catering to the lower classes who might somehow sully the children of the middle and upper classes with their lack of proper upbringing. So people thinking they're better than other people always kind of seeps in into the decisions of those things.
That's human nature, of course.
Yeah. And as documented, the private schools, there's a lot of kind of addition, became extremely unstable due to the reliance on the fees and the teachers' need to earn a living. So listen to this, because this is what we're encountering now with school pods. So, so the government, through taxation, offered the free education, and what started happening to the private schools, they became extremely unstable due to the reliance on fees and the teachers' need to earn a living, as well as provide physical resources and space for the school to take place. If a family needed to withdraw their children from school due to financial hardship, this could have the unintended consequence of putting proprietary voluntary schools also putting the school at risk of closure. In addition to private venture schools, joint stock proprietary voluntary schools also existed, and these schools were run by trustees, usually on the behalf of the denomination. So there's still religious connection there, and they were funded through the donations of or shares. These types of voluntary schools also suffered from financial instability. So in other words, even though so here's kind of the dilemma that happens. Yes, we have private schools and they rely on the they're for the upper class. But what if somebody on the upper class all of a sudden is not able to send their kids to those schools? And what if several people go through that? Now they have to withdraw their kids, and these kids have to close because there's not enough finances to pay the teachers, to pay for the maintenance of the property, and so forth.
Sounds a lot like COVID.
Well, I mean, and that's the thing. So here we are sitting and criticizing, oh, these, only rich people can pay. But rich people are just susceptible as something happening to them as the poor people.
Yeah, like shutting down the economy and preventing your business from opening because of a scam. A pandemic, or
so and this is why I'm reading this account of history and education, and I'm thinking we're coming back to the same issues we had in the 1800s. So we have to learn from history, and we have to make decisions. How are we going to structure ourselves so that we don't get the government to completely control and brainwash us, but then we can't rely on our personal resources alone? How do we make this happen? So next, communities. We have to develop communities. So in enters at this point as these things are going on, Egerton Ryerson. Okay, so here's what he did for the education in Canada. He became the chief superintendent of education in Upper Canada in 1844, a position and he held that position for 32 years. Mm-hmm. Ryerson is widely regarded as the most influential person behind creating a public school system.
He's the father of public education in Canada.
That we know in Canada, yes. He was a minister, educator, political figure in Canada who studied education systems around the Western world. So he looked at different education systems, tried to pick out what it works, and incorporated
He was
that.
Presbyterian minister, I believe, if I'm not
They
mistaken.
don't say his nomination, but he was a minister. Okay.
Mhm.
So he studies education systems in the Western world in order to design one that he thought most appropriate for Canada. So in 1846, Ryerson drafted a bill that became a Common School Act, the first major piece of education related legislation in the history of Upper Canada. The act was particularly important because it detailed the organization of the school system as it had never been described before. The act designated schools for teachers training. So, first of all, the teachers had to receive training in specific schools, and designated superintendent for each school district who would be responsible for examining schools on an annual basis and ensuring that they met the standards for the federal grants that they would be receiving. That's what's happening today. The way in which school trustees were to be elected was also detailed. It also levied a rate bill or a school tax on the parents of all children of school age. Ryerson also recommended a series of approved textbooks, um, adding that schools that used alternative textbooks not approved by the new provincial board of education would not receive the financial aid. Also, the Common School Act included a clause that assured protection of children from being required to participate in lesson or exercise of a religious orientation that the parents found objectionable. So he revolutionized our education system, but a lot of issues were started from from this legislation. Um, one of and something that we are now having to fight today is that if we choose to homeschool here in Canada,
Mhm.
we cannot not be taxed
Mhm.
for the public school board.
Yeah.
We have to have part of our taxes go to the public school board.
So strike against him for that.
Well, but the thing is, the first that, so if you had children, you had to be taxed. But later on, as I'm going to be kind of going through more of the history,
There's nothing the government likes.
later on, though, not only families with children, but all families now were to provide to have they pay taxes towards the education, public school board education.
Now, you can look at that from the perspective that they're looking at it as it is a societal good. And so, for the benefit of all, we want a well funded public education system.
Well, and they didn't want to be unstable like the charter school. So if you decide to withdraw your school and you take your funding out,
Like
then all of a sudden,
like a school pod.
yeah, so all of a sudden, that little school is suffering. So the government was ensuring the stability of the public schools.
Mhm.
And you know what? Our public education wasn't that bad, but I'm afraid to say that with the framework of the decisions that were made,
Mhm.
now that the public education system's not serving the public, now we're just paying towards something that's working against us. Again, taxes are okay towards the education system if it serves the public. But if it's not, then now we have a problem.
Yeah.
Houston.
So we gotta
Yeah, I think I will stop here. So this was the 1840s. This is all was established, and I think we could do more of a history because I think that everybody needs to understand why were the decisions made.
Mhm.
And so nowadays, some of these legislation that was decided so many years ago, I mean, that's 1840s. I mean, now we're
It's almost 200 years ago.
almost 200 years ago. We are still living under, we have to start thinking, what do we want our legislation to be like in order for our current needs to be met and for
Right.
right? So I think we'll continue speaking about this in our next show because then we have developments in Upper and Lower Canada as and you have to remember that this is before Canada was established as a nation, as independent nation. So all of these politics were still going on.
Mhm.
Okay. And so unless we know our history, we will not make good decisions about our education. But I think we believe that parents are the best people to decide what. And yes, there's going to be financial hardship. And so here at School Pods, I think actually what we're doing is we're really providing that middle class kind of education, right?
Yeah.
We're trying to make School Pods so inexpensive that cost less than daycare, really.
Yeah.
And still provide employment for teachers and provide them for with a living while the parents have more input because it's a smaller scale. It's like it's a local scale kind of schooling.
Right.
The parents get to have more influence on what they want the children to be taught in the pod. And so I think that this is the best out of all the historic ideas.
All right. Well, we've come to the end of our time, and there's so much more. I mean, we've just really begun to scratch the surface. So
Okay.
next week we will continue this discussion, and we look forward to seeing you. And thanks for joining us here on Smarten Up on lamnetwork.tv. Have a great week, everybody.
Bye-bye. Smarten up.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.